Hello everyone, welcome back to Teaching the Bible. I'm your host Michael Kotch. Teaching the Bible is a weekly television and radio program that details and explains the major events and teachings of the Bible as we move progressively through the stories of the Bible week by week. Now, the last couple of weeks we studied the kings of Israel and we covered four major kings. King Saul, King David, King Solomon, and King Rehoboam. There's many more kings than that, but those are the ones that we focused on teaching the Bible. And how we left off was the kingdom of Israel split into two kingdoms. And that was because of Solomon's great sins. God said, I will take the kingdom out of your hand, out of your son's hands. And his son was King Rehoboam, and the people of Israel came to King Rehoboam and said, your father, King Solomon, was extremely harsh on us. If you lighten the load on us, we will follow you. And he came back and said, I will be harder on you than my father, King Solomon, ever was. Well, 10 out of the 12 tribes of Israel said, well, we're not going to follow you then. And they left and they split. Now the kingdom was split in two. They became the northern kingdom of Israel, whose capital was Samaria, which might sound familiar when you think of the story of the Good Samaritan. He was from Samaria, the capital of Israel. Two tribes remained following King Rehoboam, and that would be the southern kingdom of Judah, which was made up of Judah and Benjamin. So now the kingdom of Israel was split. And what we're going to go over today are the books of Nehemiah, the books of Ezra, and the books of Esther. Now, during the times of the kings got progressively worse and worse, where they weren't following God. Instead, they turned against God, abandoned following him, and they were following other fake gods and demons and all kinds of garbage. And God finally lost his patience with them. And he warned them throughout the prophets, if you don't come back to following me, I'm going to have you conquered by a foreign power, taken away in an exile, and that's what happened. Now, the way the Bible has it chronologically laid out is a little bit out of order. What we're going to cover today are, again, I said Nehemiah, Ezra, and Esther, and they come before the prophets in the Bible, but yet what these books focus on is they lightly cover the Babylonian exile, the events, but what they focus on is God returning the Israelites back to Judah, or the people from Judah back to Judah after the Babylonian exiles are over. And he sends one man named Nehemiah to basically rebuild the city. He sends people with him to help him. It wasn't just him. And he sends another man named Ezra to be the new priest, to reteach the people who were in exile for 7 years about God. So this focuses on when the Babylonian exile is over and the people are returning, but you don't hear much about the Babylonian exile. It's kind of backwards. Later, during the times of the prophets, when we get into that, it covers the details of the Babylonian exile in depth. So let's get into it today. During the period of the kings, there were many good kings over Israel and Judah, but even more bad ones who did not follow what God instructed them to do. They ignored God's instructions and did what they wanted to do. Sometimes their actions were very sinful. Eventually, God ran out of patience with these bad kings of Israel and Judah. Israel, however, was much worse than Judah in rebelling against God and following false gods of other countries instead of our God. God warned them many times through the prophets to stop doing this, return to him, but they would not listen. Since the kings and the people of Israel, which is a northern 10 tribe, did not want to follow God's instructions, God took his help and protection away from Israel. They were conquered by the Assyrians and taken away to Assyria as captives in an exile. And they're gone for a very long time, hundreds of years. And this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, in the customs that the kings of Israel had practiced. And the people of Israel did secretly against the Lord their God things that were not right. And that's said in 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 7 and 9. Some of the practices the people of Israel engaged in included sacrificing their own sons and daughters to Baal, B-A-A-L, and other false gods. And this upset our God greatly. Therefore, the Lord was very angry with Israel, and he removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah only. That's 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 18. So in the beginning, Israel was much worse in following false gods, and despite many God's warnings, they wouldn't stop doing it. So they were taken away they were conquered and taken away to Assyria in an exile. So all that remained was the southern two-tribe kingdom of Judah. But over time, the southern two-tribe kingdom of Judah also greatly offended God by following the evil practices of the pagan nations around them. One king of Judah was particularly evil, whose name was King Manasseh. He rebuilt the temples to worship false gods and demons. He put altars to these false gods in the holy places of Judah, and he instructed the people of Judah to worship these other gods. King Manasseh burned his own son alive as a sacrifice to these other evil false gods. Wow. 2 Kings chapter 21, verses 1 to 9. As a consequence, God took his protection away from the kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Judah was captured by the very powerful pagan king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar. The people of the kingdom of Babylon were called the Chaldeans. King Nebuchadnezzar brought back to Babylon all the important and skilled people of Judah, only leaving the very poorest people behind. He also carried back to Babylon all of Judah's treasures and riches. King Nebuchadnezzar appointed a man named Zedekiah to be king over his captured territory of Judah. King Zedekiah soon rebelled against King Nebuchadnezzar. King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon and the Chaldeans invaded Jerusalem a second time because of this. They killed or captured everyone who was in the city except for the poorest of the people, who they left alone. So they left a remnant of just the poorest of the poor people that had nothing behind. And they actually took the people away twice in an exile. King Nebuchadnezzar burned all the important buildings in the kingdom to the ground, broke down the walls that surrounded Jerusalem, and carried anything of value back to Babylon. These series of events are called the Babylonian exiles, and we hear much more about them when we get into the books of the prophets. That's in 2 Kings chapter 24 and 25. Now we're going to go to the book of Nehemiah. We're going to cover Nehemiah, Ezra, and Esther. And basically, Nehemiah is a man that God stirred up the heart of the king of the Medo-Persian Empire that at that time had the Jews as captives, and stirred his heart up to let Nehemiah take a bunch of people back to rebuild Jerusalem and return the people. So Nehemiah was the man God sent back to rebuild Jerusalem. Ezra was a captive in exile that God sent back to be their new priest when Jerusalem was rebuilt, and to reteach the people about God, because living in an exile, they lost, information about him. So now we're Nehemiah. When King Nebuchadnezzar of the Chaldeans captured the city of Jerusalem and carried the people of Judah off into exile into Babylon, he broke down Jerusalem's protective walls and burned down its important buildings. There was a Jewish man named Nehemiah who was still in exile under King Artaxerxes of Persia. King Artaxerxes was a king whom God inspired to allow the exiled Jews to rebuild the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, and also appoint Ezra to be the high priest of the Jews there. This is extraordinary, because these were people that rebelled against the Babylonian Empire, which is now the Medo-Persian Empire, and they went in and captured them and took them as captives. And back then they didn't decide for no reason, these people that we conquered and took as captives, I think as king I'm going to let them all go back home. And not only am I going to let them all go back to their old home, I'm going to pay for everything, to rebuild everything. Whatever they need, I'll give them the money. They didn't do that. That was God inspiring these kings to do that for the Jews, because God wanted the Jewish people to return after the exiles. Nehemiah was the cupbearer to King Artaxerxes. Nehemiah heard that for the remnant of his people still living back in Jerusalem, which was the poorest of all the people that were just left there, the wall of the city remained torn down and its gates were destroyed. Remember, Nehemiah was a Jew in exile in the pagan empire, and he heard what was left of his hometown, which is still destroyed, and there was nothing but the poorest of the poor there. Nehemiah prayed to God that God would fix this situation. While Nehemiah was serving the king as cupbearer, the king noticed that Nehemiah looked sad. King Artaxerxes said to Nehemiah, "Why is your face sad, seeing you are not sick? There's nothing but sadness in your heart." That's Nehemiah 2, verses 2. That is a risky thing when a king says that to you, and I'll tell you why. Because back then, if you didn't look happy in front of the king, if you looked upset or miserable or something, The king was a little paranoid that you might be plotting to hurt the king, so you better look happy in front of the king. So for the king to say to you, why do you look so miserable? If he didn't say the right thing, he might have been killed. And Nehemiah became very afraid at this. However, he gathered up his courage, and he said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad? When the city, the place of my father's graves, Jerusalem, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire. And he said that in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 3. So the king asked Nehemiah what he wanted from him. Nehemiah humbly asked the king if he could send Nehemiah back to Judah so he could rebuild his homeland. The king asked him how long he would be gone and when he would return. When Nehemiah told him how long he thought it would take for him to do this, the king granted Nehemiah's request. It's kind of unheard of. The king also wrote letters to rulers of the territories under his domain to give Nehemiah the building materials he would need to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem and parts of the city. And the king granted me what I asked, said Nehemiah, for the good hand of my God was upon me. So God was causing all this to happen. That's in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1 to 8. So God moved the heart of King Artaxerxes of the Chaldeans to allow his captured cupbearer, Nehemiah, to return to his destroyed homeland of Judah to rebuild it, and the king said he would fund all of it. Nehemiah gathered a group of Jewish men, and they began to rebuild the walls and gates of Jerusalem that had been destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon earlier. They encountered opposition and threats of violence from several people who did not want the Israelites to rebuild Jerusalem. Nehemiah and his men also faced oppression from local officials as they worked. Throughout this, they prayed to God for guidance and protection, and God provided both for them. With God's help, it took Nehemiah and his men only 52 days to rebuild the wall around the entire city of Jerusalem. The enemies of Jews rebuilding the wall were astounded that it only took them 52 days to rebuild it. They realized that God was helping them do this. So out of fear of God, they no longer tried to stop the Jews from rebuilding Jerusalem. Now, although the wall around the city was now complete, there were only a few people living within Jerusalem, and none of the houses that were destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar were yet rebuilt. That's in Nehemiah chapters 3 to 6. Shortly after the wall around Jerusalem was rebuilt, 42,360 people returned from the Babylonian exile back to the areas of Jerusalem and Judah, along with approximately 7,500 male and female servants. God moved the hearts of the Israelites' captors to allow the Israelites to leave their kingdom and return back to their home. All the people gathered together, and Ezra, the scribe and priest, we're going to hear more about him next, read the book of the law of Moses to them. Remember, they're in captivity, and they didn't hear about God in this pagan country. They had to be retaught about our God. Nehemiah became the governor of the area. Jewish religious worship practice to God finally began once again in the areas of Jerusalem and Judah after the Babylonian exiles came to an end. That's in Nehemiah chapter 7 to 13. So see, Ezra was the priest of the people that returned and retaught them about God, and Nehemiah was the governor and the man who headed the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. So now we're going to read about Ezra. Within a few decades after the kingdom of Judah was conquered by the Chaldeans and its citizens were exiled to Babylon, the Babylonian kingdom transitioned into the kingdom of Persia. The Persians had a king named Cyrus. God stirred the spirit of King Cyrus to help the captured people of Judah and return them to their home. And now we're going to read a proclamation that King Cyrus gave that God inspired him to do this. Again, the Jewish people were captured people. He didn't owe them anything. But God moved him to do this. So now we're in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 to 4. The proclamation of King Cyrus. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled. Jeremiah the prophet predicted in the past, which we'll actually not read yet, but we will. He predicted all this would happen. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. And here's his proclamation. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you, of all his people, may his God be with him. and let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And let each survivor, in whatever place he sojourns, be assisted by the men of his place with silver and gold, with goods and beasts, besides freewill offerings for the house of God that is in Jerusalem. So King Cyrus said, hey, God told me, basically, I'm supposed to let you people, your Jews, go back and rebuild your city and your temple, so I'm going to do that because God told me to do that. God sent a man named Ezra to teach the Israelites about God. He sent him back. He was a scribe skilled in the law of Moses that the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. And the king granted all that he had asked, for the hand of the Lord was on Ezra. That's in Ezra chapter 7, verse 6. For Ezra had set his heart to study the law of the Lord, and to do it and to teach his statutes and rules in Israel. That's in Ezra chapter 7, verse 10. Because many of the Jews were gone, I believe, for 70 years in this exile. And so many of them were born and they're in a pagan country, didn't even really know much about God. It might have been forbidden to be taught about. So God used Ezra to reteach everybody about him. Ezra is now both a priest and a scribe. King Artaxerxes of Persia instructed Ezra to appoint magistrates and judges who might judge the people in the areas of Judah and to teach them the laws of Ezra's God. Ezra took several hundred men with him from Babylon and went to the rebuilt temple. So the temple was rebuilt, and it was rebuilt by Nehemiah's group. Remember, God sent him first to rebuild things. So God sent Ezra to the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem as King Artaxerxes had instructed him. Ezra became the head priest of the temple in Jerusalem, and he served the Jews that returned to Judah from the exile in that capacity as head priest. And what they wound up dealing with, some of the problems they dealt with, was the same problems that caused them to get exiled by God in the first place. They started to return to, let's intermarry with our pagan neighbors and start to follow their gods instead of our gods. So that started up again. That was one of the main problematic themes throughout all of the Old Testament, which was the Israelite people just could not stop walking away from God to follow false gods. And they started doing this a little bit again. And Ezra actually came down with a really heavy hand and tried to stamp it out. So now we're going to get into another book in the Bible during this time, the Babylonian exiles, the book of Esther. I really love this book. It's kind of like, reminds me of Cinderella-ish. I mean, it's a little more violent than Cinderella because people actually get killed in it, but story of a princess and saving the kingdom, and it just reminds me kind of Cinderella. Now, this is several thousand years old, so if anything, this didn't copy from Cinderella, it's the other way around. Maybe Cinderella copied some stuff from here, but it just reminds me of it. And I really think, it's a true story, it's in the Bible, it's true, it happened, but I really enjoy this. I teach Sunday school classes, and the kids really love hearing about Esther. So the book of Esther takes place during the time the Israelites are exiled in the Media Persian kingdom. Israelites in the exile during this particular period were ruled by King Ahasuerus of the kingdom of Media Persia, which encompassed 127 provinces, ranging from India to Ethiopia. The king had a huge party for his army, the princes, and the governors of the kingdom that lasted for many days. After 7 days of partying, the king ordered that his Queen Vashti, be brought to the party to show her off to everyone there, to show everybody how beautiful she was. And the queen responded, I'm not coming to your party so you can show me off to all your drunken friends about how good I look. No way. Well, that's what she said in a nutshell. And the king became pretty upset with this, that she refused to come to his party to be shown off to, basically to his drunken friends. So the king spoke to his consultants on how to handle this. And the consultant said, King, you need to replace her as queen, because I'll tell you what, if it gets out that the king gave her an order and the queen refused and nothing was done about it, none of our wives are going to listen to us after this. Every time we tell our wives to do something, we're going to say, well, the king ordered Vashti to do something, she said no, so why should I listen to you? And that's what they're afraid of. So he said, you got to get rid of her, king. And he said, okay. You'll see this King Ahasuerus kind of does whatever somebody seems to suggest to him. He's like, oh, it sounds like a good idea, and he does it. He seems to follow whatever is told him. He doesn't seem to think much for himself. But anyways, so he said, okay, we'll do that. And Queen Vashti, therefore, had her title as queen removed. Young men who were attendants of the king Ahasuerus suggested to him that he should have all the beautiful young single women from across the kingdom be brought to him, so that he may choose a queen from among them. The king thought that this was a good idea, and he made it so. That's in Esther chapter 1 and Esther chapter 2, verses 1 to 4. Now at this time, there's a good Jewish man named Mordecai. He was a Jewish exile living in the Medo-Persian kingdom that was now ruled by King Ahasuerus. His great-grandfather was brought to this kingdom by King Nebuchadnezzar, the former king of Babylon. Now it's the Medo-Persian kingdom, along with many other Jews in the Babylonian exile. Mordecai was raising up a young woman named Esther. Esther's parents died when she was young. Mordecai was an older cousin of Esther, and he adopted her as his own daughter because she had no parents. Esther is a very beautiful young woman. When the king's order was sent out to bring beautiful young single women to the palace to select a new queen, Esther was brought to the palace along with many other women. Read that in Esther chapter 2, verses 5 to 11. Esther was the nicest and most beautiful of all the women brought to the king's palace. That's nice, a good combination to have. You're beautiful and nice. Over time, she became the favorite of King Ahasuerus, and he eventually made her queen, to replace Queen Vashti, who disobeyed him. Each day during a certain time, Esther's father, Mordecai, would walk in front of the palace to find out how his daughter Esther was doing and what was happening to her as queen. Esther did not tell anyone that she was Jewish or from Israeli ancestry because her father Mordecai told her not to do that. One day when Mordecai was standing at the king's gate to hear how Esther was doing that day, two of the king's servants became angry with the king and were making plans to kill him. Mordecai overheard this. Mordecai told this to his daughter, Queen Esther, who then told this to the king, what Mordecai discovered. The two men were arrested for trying to kill the king. Mordecai might have saved the king's life by what he did. That's in Esther chapter 2, verse 19 to 23. Now there is an official at this time in the kingdom named Haman. The king promoted Haman as second in charge in the kingdom behind the king. Everyone who Haman passed had to bow down to Haman under the king's orders. Mordecai would never bow down to Haman when he passed by. Mordecai said that he was Jewish, and under Jewish law, God was the only person that men should bow down to. Jewish was a name given to the people of Israel. Remember, they were captured and living in this other country at the time in an exile. Haman became very angry at Mordecai and what he was doing. He decided not only would he kill Mordecai for not bowing down to him, he would kill every Jewish person in the whole kingdom. Esther chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. This is one of the first times in the Bible we hear of a plan to conduct a Jewish genocide, but it's not the last time. It's not the last time we hear it in history. We just faced this less than 100 years ago. Haman went to the king and said, "There are a group of people living in this kingdom called the Jews. They're not following your laws and commands, and I think it would be in the best interest in the kingdom if they be destroyed." King said to Haman, do whatever you think is the right thing to do with them. Again, he seems to do whatever people suggest to him. A letter was sent out by Haman to all the officials of the kingdom that on December 13th, all the Jews in the kingdom were to be killed. Mordecai heard about this plan, and he was extremely upset. Mordecai told his daughter, Queen Esther, that Haman planned to kill all the Jewish people in the kingdom, even her, because she was Jewish. He asked Esther as queen to do something to save the Jews and herself, because she too was Jewish, and he told her, "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" That's in Esther chapter 4, verses 14. Queen Esther sent a message to all the Jews in the kingdom to fast for 3 days and keep praying to God to save them. Queen Esther then came up with a plan to try to save her Jewish people. That's in Esther chapter 3, verses 7 to 15, and Esther chapter 4. Queen Esther went to the king and asked if a banquet could be held and to make sure that Haman was at this banquet. The king agreed. Haman was happy that he was invited to this banquet. He was later talking to his wife about it. Haman's wife reminded him that Mordecai would not bow down to him, and she suggested that a 75-foot pole be put up and Mordecai would be hanged on it at the banquet. I don't think that's a banquet I would really want to go to. Haman agreed to this. That's Esther chapter 5. The night before the banquet, the king could not sleep. He asked that his servants read to him reports of things that happened recently in the kingdom. In the reports, he discovered that Mordecai saved his life by reporting that 2 of the king's servants were planning on killing the king. The king asked, "What was done for Mordecai for saving my life?" "Nothing," they replied. The king then called in Haman, who just had finished building the 75-foot pole to hang Mordecai. The king asked Haman, "What should be done to honor a man that I like?" Haman assumed that he was going to honor him. Haman said, "I think we should put the king's robes on the man, put him on the king's horse, put the king's crown on his head, and parade him through the city saying, 'This is what happens to a man that the king honors.'" King said, "That's a great idea. Do that all for Mordecai the Jew, because he saved my life and I want to honor him." Haman became terrified. He did all those great things for Mordecai. He put the king's robes on him, put him on a horse with the king's crown on his head, and Haman paraded Mordecai through the streets saying, "This is what happens to a man that the king honors." When this was over, Haman then ran and hid, because the king now loved Mordecai, and Haman was actively trying to kill him at that moment. That's in Esther chapter 6. At the banquet, Queen Esther told the king that Haman planned not only to kill Mordecai, who saved the king's life, but he wanted to kill all the Jewish people, including her, because she was also a Jew. Well, the king became enraged at Haman. The king was told that Haman just got finished building a 75-foot pole, and he planned to hang Mordecai on it at that very banquet. The king said, "Oh, really? Well, go hang Haman on that pole that he built to kill Mordecai, who saved my life." Haman was hanged on that pole, and Mordecai and Queen Esther saved the Jews from destruction. The king stopped all the plans that Haman set to kill all the Jews on December 13th. Because Mordecai saved the king's life, he was promoted to a very powerful position in the kingdom, and he was loved by the people of the land. Read that in Esther chapter 7, 8, and 9. Well, everybody, that's it for today. I'm Michael Kotch. Hope you liked it, and I hope you tune in next week. Michael Kotch is sponsored and brought to you. Teaching the Bible is brought to you and sponsored by Michael Kotch. Take care.
Christ belongs to all people. He belongs to the whole world.
For 60 years, Billy Graham and his team took the message of Christ to the world.
Have you been born again?
Telecasts of Billy Graham crusades continue to reach millions with the gospel.
If you repent, he will forgive.
Relive these moments on Billy Graham Classics.
Jesus said, "Follow me. Come and change the world with me."